The sea was quiet before dawn, as if the world itself was holding its breath. A pale gray mist stretched across the English Channel, smoothing the waves into a soft, trembling sheet of silver. For a moment, there was only silence. The kind of silence that feels ancient, like the pause before a storm breaks, or the final breath before a truth is spoken aloud. Then, beneath that silence, a low rumble began to grow. At first it was faint, almost unnoticeable, like distant thunder rolling across a faraway sky. But with every passing minute the sound thickened, deepened, and multiplied. Metal against water. Engines throbbing. Waves hammering against steel hulls. It was not one sound but thousands, layered, rising, merging into something colossal. Slowly the mist began to shift, swirled aside by the echoes of engines powerful enough to shake the air itself. And then, through that thinning veil of gray, shapes emerged, first as shadows, then as outlines, and finally as vast silhouettes carved against the morning light. Ship after ship appeared, and then thousands more. Destroyers, battleships, landing craft, transports, support vessels, tank carriers, a floating city of steel stretching from horizon to horizon. 7,000 Allied ships advancing together in a single, unstoppable tide. Imagine standing on the cliffs of Normandy that morning. Imagine being one of the German soldiers, exhausted, chilled by the damp air, peering into the fog with nothing but the soft hum of a quiet night to keep you company. And then, as the mist peeled away, seeing the sea transformed into something unimaginable, a living, moving wall of metal, engines, men, and destiny. No human voice could describe it fully. No war before or after would ever witness anything of its scale again. Some German observers would write later that it felt like watching the sea turn solid. Others said it looked like the world was ending. A few simply stared, unable to speak, as the greatest armada in human history emerged from the fog like a vision pulled from myth. And in that moment, even before the first guns fired, even before the first landing craft hit the sand, Germany saw the war's final truth taking shape. They knew deep in their bones that this was not just an invasion. It was the beginning of an inevitability. The war that had once felt possible to win was now slipping beyond their grasp. But to understand how this moment came to be, how 7,000 ships could rise from the sea in perfect coordination, we must step back from the shoreline and look at the world that existed before this dawn. A world shaped by fear, ambition, suffering, sacrifice, and the long shadow of a conflict that had already consumed millions of lives. For Europe in 1944 was not simply a battlefield. It was a landscape built from ruins. Cities that once echoed with laughter now stood hollow, their windows shattered, their streets scarred by bomb craters. Forests that had offered quiet to generations were now filled with the smell of damp earth, gunpowder, and the lingering smoke of distant artillery. Families lived with loss as naturally as breathing. The war had seeped into everything, into the soil, into the sky, into the very rhythm of life. Across the English Channel, the Allies had spent years preparing for a single moment. One moment that required more planning, more coordination, more courage than any operation in history. The soldiers who would storm the beaches that day were not hardened heroes born for war. They were young men from quiet towns, students who had postponed their futures, farmers who had left their fields, mechanics, teachers, clerks, ordinary people pulled into extraordinary circumstances. They trained for months under cold rain, mud clinging to their boots, the smell of diesel and sweat filling the camps. They rehearsed climbing ropes, running across sand, firing under pressure, pushing through exhaustion. They wrote letters home, sometimes with shaking hands, knowing that many of those letters might become their final words. And yet they went forward. Not because they wanted war, but because they understood what waited on the other side of silence. A world where tyranny had grown too large, too dark, too powerful to ignore. The Germans, too, lived with a heavy weight. Many soldiers on those cliffs were not fanatics. They were tired, hungry, young, and older than they felt. They were fathers wishing they were home, boys who had been told glory awaited them, men who no longer believed the promises whispered from Berlin. They stood in cold concrete bunkers, sand in their boots, hands trembling slightly from long nights without sleep. Some prayed. Some stared blankly. Some wondered if they would survive the next hour. And so, on that quiet morning, with the sky still gray and the sea still trembling from the first ripples of the approaching armada, fate brought these two worlds together. The wind carried the distant hum of Allied aircraft, a steady, unbroken vibration. The soldiers on the ships felt it, their stomachs tightening with each passing second. The men in the bunkers heard it too, and a cold awareness spread through them, the awareness that something larger than war itself was approaching. As dawn finally broke, the first rays of sunlight touched the tops of the waves, turning the steel hulls into gleaming silhouettes. The mist glowed faintly as if the morning light was trying to soften the sight but could not. Perhaps this was where it all began, not the invasion itself but the realization. The knowledge, felt by everyone on both sides, that history was shifting in front of them. That choices made years earlier were converging into a single moment, and that moment was now. The Allied fleet moved forward, steady and silent, like a great heartbeat echoing across the water. Every ship had a purpose. Every division had a role. Every man had a place in the vast, unfolding design. Behind them lay the hopes of nations. Ahead of them waited the fire of war. And for the Germans on the cliffs, staring in disbelief as the fog dissolved into a wall of steel, the truth struck with the weight of inevitability. No matter what they did next, no matter how fiercely they fought, the tide had turned. The sea itself was coming for them. The world was changing. And nothing, not concrete, not barbed wire, not artillery, could stop what was rising from the water that morning. The invasion had not begun with the first step on sand. It had begun with the realization. There was no going back. The coastline of Normandy stretched out like a long, uneven scar where land met sea. In 1944 it was quiet, almost deceptively peaceful. Grass bent gently in the wind along the cliffs. Small villages slept under pale morning skies. Fields of wheat swayed softly, unaware that within hours they would be torn apart by steel and fire. The world here had the appearance of calm, but beneath that calm was a history carved by centuries of conflict, shifting empires, and the stubborn resilience of a people who had survived invasions long before this one. Not far inland, narrow roads twisted through hedgerows, ancient walls of earth and tangled vegetation that had stood since the Middle Ages. For the locals, these hedgerows had always been part of life. For the men who would fight here, they would become natural fortresses and deadly traps. Normandy's terrain was unlike anything most soldiers had ever seen. Fields broke into small, maze-like sections. Visibility was low. Every bend could hide an ambush. Every foot of land would be earned with sweat and fear. But on the morning of the invasion, the land was still silent. Only the sound of distant engines touched the air. The Germans who guarded the coastline were scattered across bunkers, lookout posts, and fortified positions along what Hitler proudly called the Atlantic Wall. But the truth was far more fragile. The wall was not continuous, not perfect, not all-powerful. Some areas were heavily fortified with concrete casemates and artillery. Others were thin, patched together with whatever could be built quickly in the years before the invasion. Many soldiers stationed along this long stretch of coast were not elite fighters. Some were older men pulled from quieter roles as the war drained Germany of manpower. Others were teenagers, drafted into service before they fully understood the meaning of war. There were even soldiers from other countries, forced into German uniforms under occupation. They spoke different languages, followed different beliefs, and carried different fears. They looked out at the sea, unaware of the scale of what was coming. Behind the German lines, villages lived in a strange half-peace. Farmers tended to their morning chores under watchful eyes. Children gathered water from wells, their laughter quiet, careful. People prayed for liberation but feared the cost it would bring. The war was everywhere and nowhere at once. Across the Channel, the Allies were finalizing their preparations. The tension among the commanders had been building for months. Every route, every tide pattern, every weather shift had been studied. A mistake could cost thousands of lives. A delay could ruin years of planning. A wrong wave height could flip landing craft before they reached the shore. The English coast had transformed into a vast staging ground. Fields held rows of trucks and tanks covered in camouflage netting. Roads were packed with jeeps and soldiers moving in long columns. Barracks were full of nervous energy, jokes spoken too quickly, cigarettes smoked down to the filter, hands trembling slightly as they loaded rifles for the final time. Many of the men had not slept properly for nights. They lay in their bunks listening to the ocean wind, wondering if they would live to see another sunrise. The smell of oil, metal, and damp earth filled the air. It mixed with the scent of canvas tents and the faint sweetness of blooming summer grass. The contrast felt surreal, life continuing beside the preparations for war. Far above, in dimly lit planning rooms, maps covered entire walls. Generals traced routes with their fingers, eyes sharp, voices low. Eisenhower studied every possibility. Could they break the German defenses fast enough? Would the weather cooperate? Would the deception plans mislead the German high command? Every detail mattered. Every life depended on the answers. Soldiers practiced climbing cargo nets again and again until their arms burned. They rehearsed jumping from landing craft into cold water, learning to keep rifles above the waves. They practiced firing on the move, crawling through mud, navigating smoke-filled fields. Yet, no training could fully prepare them for what waited beyond the horizon. At the airfields, thousands of aircraft stood ready. Fighters, bombers, troop carriers. Mechanics worked through the night, hands blackened with oil, tools clinking softly under floodlights. The smell of gasoline hung heavy in the air, mixed with the faint odor of hot engines cooling in the night breeze. And then, waiting in the massive hangars were the paratroopers, young, tense, and quiet. Some stood with hands in their pockets, tapping their boots nervously. Others smoked to ease their churning stomachs. They would be among the first to enter France, dropped into darkness behind enemy lines. Their mission would be chaos itself: secure bridges, disrupt defenses, confuse the Germans before the main landings began. Many of them wrote letters that night. Some folded them neatly and placed them in their pockets. Others tucked them deep inside their uniforms. A few could not bring themselves to write at all. The hours passed slowly. Then came the message: the invasion was on. In German headquarters, confusion ran like a cold wind through the corridors. Reports were unclear. Radar picked up movement, then lost it. Weather conditions suggested the Allies would not attempt a landing in such rough seas. Many officers believed this was just another distraction. Hitler held tightly to the idea that the real invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais, the closest point between France and England. He was certain the Allies would not choose Normandy. But certainty could not stop what was already coming. As midnight approached, Allied air fleets roared into the sky. Waves of aircraft lifted off runways, engines glowing orange in the darkness. The ground shook under the force of their takeoff. Pilots pressed forward, faces steady but hearts racing. Paratroopers sat in silence as the planes droned over the sea, their boots vibrating against metal floors. Below them, on the ships, soldiers lay packed tightly shoulder to shoulder. Some tried to sleep but could not escape the smell of diesel and the constant rocking of the waves. Others stared at photographs of wives, children, sweethearts, faces they held onto like anchors in the storm. Soft whispers floated through the dim, cramped holds. "See you on the beach. Don't think about it. We'll make it." But hope and fear sat side by side that night, tangled together in every heart. The moon was hidden behind clouds. The sea was dark, restless. Wind brushed against steel hulls, carrying the salty smell of the channel. And all the while, far ahead in the distance, the shadow of Normandy waited, a quiet land about to become the center of the world. In the bunkers along the coast, German soldiers scanned the darkness. Some saw brief flashes of light high above, reflections from aircraft wings cutting through the clouds. Others heard distant engines but did not know what to make of them. Orders were unclear. Radios crackled with static. And then, just before dawn, everything began to shift. The mist thickened. The sky slowly brightened. Birds stirred in the cliffs. And from somewhere across the water came that first faint tremor, a vibration that seemed to rise from the sea itself. It was the beginning of something vast, something unstoppable, something that would change not only the course of a war, but the course of human history. The ships were coming. And nothing, not confusion, not hope, not fear, could stop the tide now moving toward Normandy's sleeping shore. As dawn crept over the horizon, The gray waters of the English Channel revealed their secret. What had been distant rumbling in the darkness now became a sight so massive, so overwhelming, that even the most seasoned soldiers felt the breath catch in their throats. The mist lifted slowly as if nature itself hesitated to reveal what lay behind the veil. But the truth emerged all the same. Row after row of ships appeared, each one cutting through the waves with deliberate purpose. They stretched out farther than the eye could see, their silhouettes rising like moving monuments against the first pale light of morning. It was a fleet unlike anything the world had ever witnessed. Destroyers, cruisers, battleships, troop transports, supply vessels, landing craft by the thousands, a living sea of steel. The scale felt impossible, almost unreal. For the German soldiers watching from the cliffs and bunkers, it was like watching the horizon turn into iron. Some gripped their binoculars tighter, hands trembling as they tried to understand what they were seeing. Others stared in stunned silence, their mouths slightly open, the color draining from their faces. One German officer would later write in his diary, "The sea was covered with ships, and behind them came more. It felt as if the ocean itself had turned against us." And perhaps that was true. Perhaps the world had reached a point where the weight of history, the suffering, the destruction, the cruelty spread across continents, demanded a turning of the tide. Here on this coastline that turning had arrived. The Allied fleet advanced with steady determination. On the decks, thousands of men tightened their gear and took deep breaths. The salty air pressed against their faces. The wind carried the distant smell of smoke from naval guns warming up. The sea rose and fell beneath them in slow, heavy motions, each wave reminding them of the narrow line between life and death. Some men whispered prayers. Others gripped their rifles to steady their hands. A few stared straight ahead, their minds blank, trying to stay calm as the weight of the moment settled onto their shoulders. Every soldier knew that within minutes, history would no longer be abstract. It would be sand under their boots, bullets slicing through the air, and explosions shaking the earth. The naval bombardment began suddenly, with a violence that tore the quiet morning apart. Massive guns from Allied battleships opened fire, sending thunderous echoes rolling across the coast. Flashes of orange fire burst from gun barrels, followed by long, trailing plumes of smoke. Shells screamed through the sky, leaving curling white trails behind them before crashing into German fortifications with earth-shaking force. The cliffs trembled. Concrete bunkers shook. Dust and debris shot into the air as explosions hammered the shoreline again and again. Some German soldiers lunged for cover, choking on smoke and dust. Others grabbed their helmets, stumbling toward their firing positions, hearts slamming inside their chests. From the decks of the ships, soldiers watched the bombardment with wide eyes. The ground ahead looked like it was bursting open, pieces of earth flying upward in violent sprays. The smell of gunpowder spread across the water. The sky flashed in rapid bursts of light, painting the mist in shifting shades of orange and white. The men knew the shells were meant to clear the way. They also knew many defenses would survive. And so, as landing craft were lowered into the water, one by one, row after row, a quiet understanding passed through them. No matter how powerful the bombardment was, the true test would come when their boots touched the shore. The landing craft hit the water with loud splashes. Engines roared to life. Soldiers packed shoulder to shoulder felt the craft shake, tilting and bouncing on the rough waves. The metal floor vibrated beneath their feet. Water splashed in through the sides, cold and sharp against their legs. The ramps were still up, shielding them from the view of the shore. They could not yet see the cliffs, the bunkers, the machine gun nests waiting for them. All they heard was the roar of naval guns behind them and the steady thumping of their boat engines pushing toward land. For many, this was the longest journey of their lives, even though it lasted only minutes. The German defenders, shaken but alive, began firing. Machine guns rattled from hidden positions. Mortar shells arced through the air in lazy but deadly curves. Some hit the water with heavy splashes. Others exploded mid-air, sending shrapnel slicing downward. The soldiers inside the landing craft ducked instinctively, pressing their helmets close to their heads. Shrapnel pinged off the metal hulls. A few boats shuddered violently as bullets hit their sides. Officers shouted commands over the roaring engines, their voices strained but steady. Between the explosions an eerie rhythm formed, the pounding of waves, the crack of gunfire, the distant thunder of battleships firing again. It was as if the entire world had become a drum of war, beating in brutal, unstoppable patterns. At Utah Beach, the currents pushed some of the landing craft off course. What could have been deadly luck turned into a blessing when the troops landed at a lighter defended area. Officers quickly regrouped, guiding their men inland with calm determination. They moved fast, cutting through wire obstacles, dodging fire, pressing forward. Utah's landings would become one of the least costly of the day. But at Omaha Beach the story was very different. The cliffs were steep, the bunkers reinforced, the machine gunners highly positioned. Many German defenders here were veterans, hardened by years of war. Their field of fire was perfect. Their lines of sight stretched across the entire beach. Their orders were clear. And as the first landing craft approached Omaha Beach, those guns opened fire. Bullets tore into the water, kicking up sharp splashes. The landing craft shook violently. Men ducked down, trying to make themselves small, gripping anything they could. The noise was overwhelming, bullets rattling against metal, engines screaming, men shouting, waves crashing. Then came the hardest moment of all. The ramps dropped. Sunlight burst into the cramped interior. Cold air rushed in. And in front of the soldiers, the beach stretched out as a long, deadly corridor filled with barbed wire, mines and machine gun fire raining down from the cliffs. Some men were cut down the moment they stepped forward. Others leaped into the water, sinking into chest-deep waves as they fought to push toward shore. Their boots became heavy with water. Their gear pulled them down. The cold struck their bodies like a physical blow. Still they moved. Some crawled through the sand, dragging themselves inch by inch. Others hid behind obstacles, catching their breath before sprinting again. Officers shouted directions, some even standing tall under fire to lead their men forward. Medics rushed to the wounded, ignoring the bullets that whistled past them. For every foot of ground gained, there was struggle. For every moment of progress, there was sacrifice. And yet, through the fear, through the terror, through the chaos, something else began to appear. A slow, steady shift. A breakthrough forming out of pain and determination. The soldiers refused to stop. The tide rose around them, pushing at their backs like a silent ally. Small groups broke through wire. Others climbed the cliffs. More poured in behind them, wave after wave. Germany's strongest beach defense, the wall that was supposed to be unbreakable, began to tremble. Nothing could stop the force pressing toward those cliffs. Not fear. Not fire. Not the weight of years of war. The Allied soldiers were not fighting for territory alone. They were fighting for a world they hoped still existed beyond the smoke. A world where freedom could return, where tyranny would fall, where the darkness that had swallowed Europe could finally be pushed back. And as the sun climbed higher, illuminating the cliffs of Normandy, a truth that had been forming since dawn finally became clear. Even here, even under the deadliest fire, the tide was turning. Slowly, painfully but unmistakably the invasion was succeeding. And Germany could feel it. They could feel history shifting beneath their feet. Smoke drifted across the beaches like thin gray curtains, twisting and curling in the cold morning wind. The sand trembled with each explosion. Craters opened where moments earlier there had been smooth, untouched earth. The noise had become a constant, unbroken roar, gunfire, shouting, crashing waves, the endless thunder of artillery echoing from the ships still firing offshore. Yet within that chaos, the shape of something new was forming. Small breakthroughs were happening. Quiet at first, then larger, then undeniable. At Omaha, engineers crawled through machine gun fire to clear wire obstacles. Some worked with bare hands when their tools were lost. Others placed explosive charges while lying flat on the sand, praying the detonation would not take them too. When the smoke cleared, paths opened for infantry to surge forward. On the cliffs, a handful of soldiers found narrow footpaths carved by centuries of wind and rain. They climbed silently, their fingers gripping the rough stone, their boots sliding on loose soil. German machine gunners, so focused on the beach, did not see them coming. When the Americans reached the top, exhausted and covered in mud, they fought fiercely to secure a foothold. It was small, fragile, but it changed everything. Further west at Utah Beach, Troops pushed inland with surprising speed. They moved through marshes, across fields, past farmhouses with shuttered windows. German resistance was scattered here, unsure, disorganized. The soldiers pressed deeper, securing bridges, crossroads, and crucial routes toward the interior of France. At Gold, Juno, and Sword Beaches, British and Canadian troops pushed through fierce resistance. They advanced through minefields, knocked out bunkers with well-placed charges, and used tanks, specially designed for the landings, to break German strongpoints. The fighting was brutal, but the momentum was real. Foot by foot, yard by yard, the Allied forces were carving their way into Europe. Behind the beaches, chaos spread through the German ranks. Orders clashed with counter-orders. Reports contradicted one another. Officers struggled to understand the size of the invasion, believing for precious hours that Normandy was only a diversion. Many German divisions, the ones expected to lead counterattacks, were held back by direct command from Hitler. He slept through the early hours of the invasion, his staff too frightened to wake him. Those who dared believe the Allies were still planning a second, larger attack elsewhere. But the truth was already unfolding on the sand. The Allied foothold was growing. And with each passing moment, Germany's chance to throw the invaders back into the sea was slipping away. By mid-morning, the beaches of Normandy were a landscape of smoke, screams, courage, and survival. Medics moved across the sand in frantic zigzags, kneeling beside the wounded, applying bandages, giving morphine, whispering words of comfort over the roar of battle. Chaplains prayed with dying men. Soldiers who had lost their units gathered together, forming new groups, pressing forward with determination born from necessity. All the while, the ships offshore continued their relentless fire. Shells whistled overhead, smashing into bunkers, trenches, and gun positions. The earth shook as German defenses crumbled piece by piece. Every time a bunker fell silent, a wave of relief washed through the attacking soldiers. Yet fear was never far behind. For every defense destroyed, another opened fire somewhere else. Mortar shells fell unpredictably, sending showers of sand into the air. Smoke burned the eyes. Sweat mixed with dirt on their faces. The taste of salt water lingered on their tongues. Still they pushed forward. Some soldiers found themselves fighting through quiet farmland moments after leaving the chaos of the beach. The contrast felt unreal, cows wandering in fields, birds fluttering from trees, the distant smell of wet grass carried on the wind. But even this peaceful countryside was filled with danger. German snipers hid in barns. Machine guns were placed behind haystacks. Mines lay hidden beneath the soil. War had touched every corner of this land. As the day progressed, paratroopers who had been scattered during the night began to regroup. Some had landed miles off course, finding themselves alone in dark fields surrounded by enemy patrols. They navigated using moonlight, church towers, and pure instinct. Now, as dawn turned to morning, small groups found one another and moved toward their objectives. They secured roads. They defended bridges. They ambushed German convoys trying to reach the beaches. Their presence deep behind enemy lines created confusion, tying down German reinforcements that might otherwise have crushed the landings. In many ways, these scattered, determined groups of airborne soldiers were the invisible threads holding the invasion together. As the sun climbed higher, the battle shifted again. The German defenders, realizing that the attack was not a diversion, launched counterattacks where they could. Tanks rolled from villages. Infantry advanced through hedgerows. Artillery crews rushed to set up new firing positions. The Germans fought with stubborn resilience, pushing back hard, determined to contain the Allied advance. For the Allied troops, moving inland was a new kind of hell. The hedgerows became natural fortresses. Dense walls of earth and vegetation turned every field into a trap. Visibility dropped to a few meters. Ambushes came from unseen corners. Grenades rolled out from hidden trenches. Machine guns opened from holes in the earth. The hedgerows, so peaceful in appearance, became deadly battlegrounds. Still the Allies pressed on. Tank crews used steel blades to cut paths through the hedges. Infantry adapted, learning to fight close, using grenades, shotguns, and rifles in tight spaces. Officers coordinated advances one field at a time. Communication lines stretched across the countryside, radios crackling with urgent voices. Every step forward came at a cost. But with every minute, the Allied presence grew stronger. More landing craft arrived. More troops poured onto the beaches. Supplies rolled onto the sand, ammunition, fuel, food, medical equipment. Engineers built makeshift roads across wrecked terrain. Columns of soldiers marched inland, their silhouettes dark against the horizon. The Germans felt the pressure tightening around them. Some fought with desperate fury. Others began to fall back, overwhelmed by the sheer weight of the invasion. Vehicles ran low on fuel. Ammunition dwindled. Lines of communication broke down. The once proud Atlantic Wall was cracking, not from one blow but from thousands. By late afternoon, something extraordinary was happening. The Allies were linking their beachheads. The scattered points on the map, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, Sword, were slowly becoming one connected front. The dream of the invasion planners, the hope of millions across occupied Europe, was taking shape in real time. Germany had not been pushed back yet. The days ahead would be bloody, brutal, and long. The battles inland would test every soldier in ways they had never imagined. But here on this first day, a truth was becoming clear. The invasion had succeeded. The foothold was secure. And the world that Germany had controlled through fear, conquest, and darkness was beginning to slip from its grasp. As evening shadows fell across Normandy, and the smell of smoke settled into the cold air, both sides felt the same realization. A door had opened. A turning point had arrived. And the war, though far from over, had begun to bend toward its final shape. Evening approached slowly, as if the sun itself hesitated to descend upon the changed world below. The sky over Normandy turned from pale blue to a deep, burnished gold, then into the muted colors of dusk. Smoke lingered above the beaches like a low, shifting cloud. The air tasted of burned metal and salt. The earth trembled now and then as distant artillery fired into the twilight. The first day of the invasion was drawing to a close, but the fight for Normandy was only beginning. Everywhere across the coastline, the scenes of war told their own stories. On the beaches, medics knelt over the wounded, their hands stained with blood and sand as they worked tirelessly, comforting soldiers who cried out for help, for water, for loved ones far away. Chaplains walked silently between rows of the fallen, whispering prayers that dissolved into the wind. Debris lay scattered across the sand. Destroyed landing craft, burned-out vehicles, broken weapons, abandoned helmets, torn packs, twisted pieces of metal. Each object carried a story of struggle, fear, and courage. The tide moved in and out slowly, touching these remains as if trying to wash away the memory of violence. But war leaves marks that even the sea cannot erase. Inland, fields that had been quiet just hours earlier were now filled with activity. Soldiers moved through hedgerows with rifles raised, listening for the faintest rustle that might signal danger. Officers studied maps under the dim light of lanterns. Radios crackled with updates, warnings, and calls for support. The Germans had not given up. Far from it. German commanders, now fully aware of the invasion's scale, scrambled to respond. Divisions were ordered to move toward the coast. Tanks rolled out from towns and villages. Infantry formed defensive lines in the countryside, using the hedgerows as natural barriers. Mortar crews tested the wind before firing rounds into fields where Allied troops had begun to gather. Some units moved quickly. Others were delayed by confusion, fuel shortages, lack of clear orders. Many were trapped in the chaos created by Allied air superiority. Bombed roads and destroyed bridges turned their journey into a maze of obstacles. Paratroopers hiding in the countryside attacked convoys, forcing the Germans to divert troops into small but costly skirmishes. By the time evening settled fully over Normandy, the German defense was a patchwork, strong in some places, crumbling in others. But one thing was clear: they were preparing for a counterattack. The Allied commanders knew it too. They could feel the pressure building, like a storm gathering force beyond the horizon. The beachheads had been secured, but the danger was far from over. The first 24 hours of the invasion had tested the courage of thousands. The next days would test their endurance. With nightfall came a strange quiet, broken only by the occasional gunshot or distant explosion. Soldiers dug shallow trenches and set up positions among the hedgerows. Some sat on overturned crates, eating cold rations in silence, their faces lit by the pale glow of the moon. Others leaned against trees, trying to rest but unable to shake the tension in their bodies. In the shadows, the land itself seemed alive. The hedgerows whispered in the wind. Cows moved slowly through darkened fields. Crickets clicked softly. The sounds of nature returned, but mixed with the uneasy echoes of battle. Many soldiers thought of home. They pictured warm kitchens, familiar streets, the voices of family. These memories were calming, yet painful, reminders of what they were fighting for and what they might never see again. Some wrote letters to reassure loved ones. Others simply stared at the stars, letting the cool night air wash over them as they tried to understand the enormity of what they had witnessed. Across the German lines, young soldiers sat nervously in their positions, their rifles resting on their knees. Officers whispered urgently, planning the next day's moves. Some spoke confidently, clinging to discipline and duty. Others were quiet, their faces pale with worry. They felt the presence of the Allied force growing behind the darkness. They knew reinforcements were arriving by the minute. Tanks, vehicles, artillery, soldiers, an unending flow of men and machines moving steadily inland. The realization was difficult to ignore. The invasion had succeeded. But Germany had not yet accepted defeat. Their orders were clear: push the Allies back into the sea. Drive them off the continent before they could build a larger foothold. For the German High Command, retreat was unthinkable. Surrender was impossible. The only option was to fight with everything they had left. For many German soldiers, these orders felt like shadows pressing on their minds. They were tired. They were outnumbered. Their air support was nearly gone. Their lines were stretched thin. But duty anchored them to their posts. And so, the night before the great counterattacks began, both sides prepared in silence. In the Allied camp, generals studied new maps. They traced the outlines of captured territories, marking areas still heavy with enemy presence. They calculated supply needs, reinforcement schedules, and communication routes. Every decision mattered. Every mistake could cost hundreds of lives. In German headquarters, officers argued about strategy. Some insisted on immediate attacks. Others warned that rushing in without coordination would lead to disaster. Tension filled the rooms like a cold mist. Radios buzzed with frantic messages from units scattered across Normandy. The weight of the moment pressed heavily on the land. It was the beginning of a struggle that would stretch far beyond a single day. Normandy's quiet hills and fields would soon become a vast battlefield where courage and fear collided in every corner. Yet even as the uncertainty thickened, the truth remained visible to those willing to see it. The Allied foothold was expanding. More troops were arriving. More equipment. More supplies. The tide of war, once firmly in Germany's favor, was now shifting. Not quickly. Not dramatically. But steadily, like water wearing away stone. By midnight, the skies above Normandy hummed with the steady drone of aircraft. Transport planes flew over carrying supplies and reinforcements. Fighters patrolled the air. Bombers targeted German positions deeper inland, disrupting the enemy's attempts to regroup. The night was alive with faint glimmers of light, the flash of distant explosions, the tracing fire of anti-aircraft guns, the glow of burning vehicles left behind on roads. And beneath those lights, soldiers on both sides waited. Some prayed for dawn. Some feared it. But all knew that the coming day would shape the fate of nations. When the sun rose again, it would rise on a world forever changed. It would shine on a coastline where courage had been tested, on fields where footsteps had carved the first pathways to liberation, on villages that would soon taste freedom after years of darkness. And somewhere, deep in the minds of the German commanders watching the map of Normandy fill with Allied forces, a single unspoken truth had begun to spread. This invasion could not be stopped. The war's end, distant, uncertain, costly, had begun to take shape. And the shape was final. Dawn returned to Normandy with a muted glow, soft and pale as it slipped across the smoke-stained sky. The first light brushed gently over the hedgerows, over the broken sand, over the men who had slept little or not at all. The morning carried the smell of damp earth mixed with gunpowder, a cold, harsh reminder that the previous day's violence had not ended, only paused. The birds began to stir again, fragile voices rising in scattered pockets of trees. Their sounds felt strangely out of place, like small echoes from a world untouched by war. But they reminded the soldiers, if only for a moment, that life still existed beyond the conflict. The Allied lines were wider now, stronger, more organized. Officers walked along dirt paths calling out orders. Engineers repaired radio lines and cleared rubble from makeshift roads. Trucks moved slowly across uneven ground, carrying ammunition, fuel, and supplies. Tanks rumbled forward, their engines growling softly as they took positions for the battles soon to come. The men who marched behind them felt a new weight in their steps. Not exhaustion, though that was heavy too, but the realization that the invasion was no longer a daring gamble. It was now a responsibility. They had broken through the beaches. They had survived the storm of gunfire and chaos. And now they had to hold what they had gained. But holding it would not be easy. The Germans were preparing their counterattack. Across miles of occupied countryside, German units moved quietly under the trees. Tanks rolled along muddy roads, their treads crunching through the earth. Infantry marched with determined faces, aware that the future of the Western Front depended on what would happen next. Officers studied maps marked with red arrows that pointed toward the beaches, calculating the best places to strike. The German leadership believed that if they could break the Allied lines now, while the beachheads were still fragile, while the roads were still clogged, while the fields were still unfamiliar, they might yet throw the invaders back into the sea. And so, as morning rose over Normandy, the land held its breath once more. The hedgerows, ancient and thick, became the front line of a new kind of war. These dense walls of tangled roots and shrubs had shaped the region for centuries, dividing farms and guiding livestock. But for soldiers, they were confusing, disorienting barriers that hid both danger and safety. Every field was a maze. Every corner held uncertainty. Small groups of Allied soldiers moved cautiously along narrow lanes, rifles raised, eyes scanning for movement. Their boots pressed into the damp soil, leaving shallow prints that the morning breeze could not erase. When they reached a hedgerow, they paused, listened, then climbed over or passed through gaps carved by artillery. Sometimes the fields beyond were empty and quiet. Sometimes they were filled with shadows that held the crack of gunfire. The Germans used the hedgerows with deadly skill. Their machine gun nests were hidden deep in the earth, surrounded by thick vegetation. Mortar teams fired from positions the Allies could barely see. Snipers watched from trees and farmhouses, their rifles steady, their breathing calm. The fight became close and brutal. Soldiers found themselves firing at enemies only a few meters away. Grenades tossed into hedges exploded in violent bursts that showered earth and leaves in all directions. Smoke drifted between the fields, clinging to the ground. Again and again men advanced, fell back, regrouped, and pushed forward. The air filled with the sharp smells of gunpowder, crushed grass, and the metallic scent of blood. Yet even here, in the tight spaces between hedgerows, where fear pressed closer than the enemy, the Allies found ways to adapt. Tank crews affixed steel plows to the fronts of their Shermans, creating improvised hedgerow cutters that tore gaps through the ancient walls. Infantry learned to move in coordinated bursts, one group providing covering fire while another advanced. Officers adjusted strategies with each engagement, turning confusion into experience, experience into momentum. Every field won felt like a small island of progress in a sea of resistance. Meanwhile, deeper inland, German commanders grew increasingly desperate. Reports arrived from every direction. Allied troops pushing forward, British and Canadian divisions gaining ground near Caen, American forces consolidating positions around Corentin, paratroopers holding crucial roads despite relentless pressure. The German lines were stretching thin. Fuel shortages delayed tank battalions. Communication failures left units isolated. The constant presence of Allied aircraft made movement dangerous. Every attempt to reinforce a weakened sector risked being spotted, bombed, or cut off. And all the while, the Allied foothold kept expanding like a slow but unstoppable tide. Still, the Germans fought with fierce determination. Their soldiers were tired but experienced, forced into a battle where every day felt like a race against time. They attacked from hedgerow to hedgerow, firing until their ammunition ran low, then falling back and setting up again. They used the terrain with near-perfect knowledge, turning every bend in a lane into an ambush and every barn into a defensive point. For the Allied troops, the struggle became deeply personal. They saw friends fall beside them. They carried the wounded through thick mud. They whispered encouragement to one another during quiet moments, trying to keep fear from taking hold. And when the enemy counterattacked, they stood firm, knowing that the strength of the invasion depended on their endurance. In the afternoons, when the sun hung overhead and heat settled into the air, the land would grow strangely still. For brief moments the guns fell silent. Soldiers wiped sweat from their brows, drank from canteens and took deep breaths of the warm, dusty air. They listened for footsteps, for the distant hum of aircraft, for anything that might signal what would come next. Often the silence lasted only minutes. Then the battle began again, a mortar shell landing somewhere behind the lines, a machine gun firing from a hidden position, an order shouted through the fields. And the fight would surge once more like a wave crashing through the hedges. As the days passed, the Allies began capturing villages that had been occupied for years. Some were nearly destroyed, their stone walls cracked by shellfire, their streets littered with broken wagons and debris. Others were strangely intact, left behind when German troops withdrew or were forced to retreat. In these villages, life flickered faintly. French civilians emerged slowly from cellars and barns, blinking at the daylight, tears forming as they saw the uniforms of their liberators. They offered water to soldiers, pointed out German positions and whispered words of gratitude. Some cried quietly as they walked through streets they once knew well, now changed by the long shadow of occupation. For the first time in years, a sense of hope stirred in Normandy's small towns. The Allied soldiers felt it too. They felt it in the faces of the people they helped, in the voices that thanked them through trembling lips, in the small moments of humanity that reached through the smoke. These moments mattered. They reminded the men why they had crossed the sea, why they fought through fear, why they endured the sights and sounds of war. And as the Germans fought to hold their ground, even they sensed the shift happening around them. The growing pressure, the tightening circle, the way each Allied advance, however small, combined into something larger, something irreversible. The invasion was no longer a question of if. It had become a question of when. And in the backs of their minds, in quiet corners of command rooms and trenches alike, German officers began to understand the truth that had been forming since the first ships appeared on the horizon. The war was turning against them. Not by accident. Not by luck. But by the relentless force of an alliance determined to reclaim a continent from darkness. And though the battles ahead would be long and brutal, nothing could erase the feeling that now grew stronger with each passing day. The tide that landed on Normandy was still rising, and Germany could not stop it. Days turned into nights, and nights returned to dawn, each one stitching itself into the vast tapestry of the Normandy campaign. What had begun with the thunder of ships and the chaos of beaches was now transforming into a grinding, relentless struggle across fields, villages, and ancient hedgerows. The invasion had landed. The foothold was secured. But the battle to break free of Normandy had only begun. The countryside, beautiful yet unforgiving, became a world of shadows and narrow paths. Tall hedgerows pressed in from all sides, creating corridors where danger could wait in silence. Soldiers learned quickly that every rustle of leaves, every flicker of movement, every sudden hush in the breeze could be a warning. The land itself seemed to breathe beneath them. Here in this dense green maze the Germans fought with stubborn skill. Their defensive positions were hidden with such care that even experienced officers struggled to locate them. Machine gun nests were dug deep into the earth. Snipers lay still for hours in thick undergrowth, their rifles propped against branches heavy with summer leaves. Mortar teams worked from unseen hollows, vanishing before the Allies could locate their fire. The Americans, British, and Canadians adapted inch by inch. They learned to read the hedgerows, to move cautiously, to break through barriers with new tactics. Tanks cut pathways through the green walls, their metal teeth biting into roots and soil. Infantry advanced in small groups, covering one another, whispering commands, fighting for each field as if it were an entire continent. Progress was slow. Exhaustion settled deep in their bones. Yet still they moved forward. For every step they took inland, the German command felt the pressure intensify. Their divisions were stretched thin, forced to defend vast areas with dwindling supplies and shrinking reserves. Fuel shortages crippled armored units. Air support was nearly gone, overwhelmed by Allied air dominance. Communications failed. Morale cracked. But still they fought, not because they believed victory was possible but because retreat was forbidden. In the village of Corentin, American paratroopers faced some of the fiercest fighting since the landings. The town was a crucial link between the Utah and Omaha beachheads. Without it, the two American landing zones would remain isolated, vulnerable to counterattack. The Germans understood its importance as well. They defended it with ferocity. The battle raged through narrow streets lined with stone houses. Fire echoed between the buildings, turning the village into a maze of smoke and broken walls. Paratroopers moved from doorway to doorway, hearts pounding, breath sharp, boots slipping on rubble. German machine guns fired from shattered windows. Mortars exploded in courtyards. Flames spread across rooftops, filling the air with acrid smoke. The fighting lasted for days. And when Corentin finally fell, the breakthrough connected the American front, creating a unified line that stretched from Utah to Omaha. Soldiers who had landed miles apart were now fighting side by side, their efforts merging into a single, unstoppable force. Further east, the British and Canadian troops advanced toward Caen, a city whose capture was critical to Allied plans. But Caen was heavily defended, and the Germans fought for it with unmatched determination. The city became a symbol of resistance, a place where both sides poured their strength into fierce, costly battles. Tanks clashed in open fields. Infantry pushed through bombed-out streets. Artillery pounded German positions day and night. But the defenders held on, their resolve stiffened by orders from above and fear of what defeat would mean. The battle for Caen was not a single engagement but a series of brutal clashes that lasted weeks. Each district, each neighborhood, each intersection had to be taken separately. The city became a landscape of dust, fire, and shattered stone. The smell of smoke lingered in the air long after the fighting moved forward. For the civilians trapped within its walls, liberation came with fear and hope intertwined. Families huddled in basements as shells exploded above them. Windows shattered. Streets cracked open. Buildings crumbled. But when Allied troops finally entered the city, weary and covered in grime, the people of Caen emerged with tears in their eyes. Some embraced the soldiers. Some simply stared, stunned that the world beyond occupation had returned at last. These small moments, a handshake, a smile, a voice whispering "thank you," carried a weight that no map could show. They reminded the soldiers of the lives behind the war, the people whose futures depended on their courage. And they reminded the Germans too that the tide was shifting. Across the front, German commanders felt a growing unease. Reports spoke of Allied advantage not just in manpower but in spirit. The invaders fought with purpose. Their morale was lifted by each liberated village, each successful advance. The Germans fought with skill and discipline, but a sense of inevitability had begun to creep into their thoughts. Even the land, once an ally to German defenders, seemed to turn against them. Their positions became exposed as the Allies learned new tactics. Their supply routes were bombed day after day. Their leaders argued, searching for solutions that no longer existed. And above it all, the sky belonged to the Allies. Fighter aircraft patrolled from dawn to dusk, their engines roaring across the clouds. Bombers struck railways, bridges, and convoys far behind enemy lines. German troops moved at night to avoid being seen, but even then the moonlight sometimes betrayed them. The sound of approaching aircraft sent chills through entire battalions. Every hour, every day the German ability to strike back weakened. Yet there was one truth the Allies understood clearly: a cornered enemy is most dangerous. The German army, though battered, remained formidable. Their tanks, the Panthers, the Tigers, were powerful machines that dominated open ground. Their infantry was experienced. Their commanders were skilled. And they were preparing a major counterattack. The Allies could feel it coming. Scouts reported troop movements. Intercepted communications hinted at armored concentrations deep in the countryside. Local resistance fighters whispered warnings of German reinforcements gathering for a decisive blow. The land seemed to tighten around this growing tension. Fields fell silent. Birds flew low. Smoke from far-off battles mixed with the clouds. Soldiers felt it in their bodies. That uneasy sensation before something significant breaks. They checked their rifles again, adjusted their helmets, listened to the breeze, spoke quietly among themselves. The invasion had succeeded, yes, but Normandy was not yet won. Something larger was building. Something fierce. Something desperate. And when it arrived, it would determine whether the Allies could break out of the countryside, or be pushed back into the sea. Germany was preparing to strike with everything it had left. And the next clash would reveal, more than anything else so far, the war's final truth. The German counterattack did not arrive as a sudden blow. Instead, it crept toward the Allied lines with a slow, simmering fury. The days leading up to it were filled with tension, like the air before a summer storm. Soldiers felt it in their shoulders, in their quiet moments, in the way officers spoke with lower voices than usual. Something heavy was drawing near. It began with a faint rumble of engines, deep, metallic vibrations rolling through the ground long before anyone could see their source. German tanks, some of the most feared in the war, were moving across the countryside. Panthers with their sloped armor, tigers with their massive guns, deadly in open terrain and frightening even to the bravest soldiers. Their silhouettes appeared like dark giants through the thin morning mist, engines growling as they pushed forward. The Germans were determined to crush the Allied foothold once and for all. In farmhouses and barns converted into command posts, Allied officers received reports that chilled the room. Columns of enemy armor were advancing from multiple directions. Infantry units were massing behind them. Artillery positions were being set up in orchards and behind ridges. Everything pointed to a coordinated assault designed to split the Allied lines wide open. In the hedgerows, soldiers waited. They checked their ammunition, adjusted their gear, pressed their backs against cool earthen walls, and strained their ears for the sounds carried on the wind. Then it began. A sudden explosion erupted in a distant field, a German artillery shell slamming into the earth. Another followed, then another. Within minutes the bombardment spread across the front, shaking the ground like rolling thunder. Soil burst upward in great violent fountains. Dust and debris rained down. The hedgerows trembled from the shock. Allied troops hunkered low, helmets pulled over their eyes, bodies pressed firmly against the earth. The bombardment grew louder, heavier. The air filled with screaming shell fragments and the bitter scent of burning powder. Then, in the pauses between explosions, came the unmistakable grind of tank treads. The Germans were coming. The first armored vehicles broke through the smoke like enormous beasts. Their guns fired with thunderous force, shells streaking across fields and shattering trees in their path. Behind them came waves of infantry, disciplined, experienced, moving quickly from cover to cover. The Allied positions were hit with brutal intensity. Machine gun nests rattled as soldiers fired through narrow gaps in the hedgerows. Anti-tank crews scrambled to set up their weapons, pulling them into position with shaking hands. Mortar teams dropped shells into tubes as fast as they could. Radio operators shouted coordinates over the static, sweat running down their faces. The fields of Normandy erupted into chaos. In some places, German tanks smashed through hedgerows, bursting into clearings with shocking speed. Their machine guns swept across the ground, forcing Allied troops to scatter for cover. In others, the tanks were slowed by thick vegetation, trapped in the tight corridors of the countryside, unable to maneuver effectively. This was where the Allies pushed back. Anti-tank guns fired from hidden angles, the shells slamming into metal armor with ear-splitting cracks. Bazooka teams crawled through the tall grass, hearts pounding, pulling themselves close enough to strike. Some got their shots off and watched flames burst from the tank's rear. Others were spotted before firing, and fell under crushing waves of machine gun fire. The fighting was close, brutal, unpredictable. Infantry on both sides traded fire at distances so short they could see the expressions on each other's faces. Grenades arced over hedges, exploding in blasts that sent dirt and shrapnel flying. The air became thick with smoke, dust, and the sharp smells of gunpowder and crushed vegetation. Officers moved among their men, shouting orders, rallying the frightened, directing fire. Medics crawled under bullets to reach the wounded, their hands stained red as they worked desperately to save lives. In the sky above, the Allies found their advantage. Aircraft swooped in low, engines roaring, wings cutting through the smoke. The roar of P-47 Thunderbolts and Typhoons filled the air. Pilots spotted the German tank columns and dove toward them, releasing rockets and dropping bombs with precision. Explosions lit the fields in fiery bursts. Tanks burned, sending black smoke spiraling upward. Infantry scattered as planes circled back for another run. The Germans fought with incredible determination, but each hour their strength thinned. The tanks that managed to push deep into Allied lines found themselves isolated, their supply routes cut by airstrikes and artillery. Some tried to retreat. Others held their ground until their ammunition ran low. By late afternoon, the counterattack began to falter. The German units had thrown everything they could into the assault, but the Allies were too many, too coordinated, too firmly held by a sense of purpose that could not be shaken. Reinforcements poured in. Tanks rolled forward. Artillery fire grew heavier. The hedge-lined fields echoed with the sounds of battle, but the momentum had shifted. The Germans could feel it. Their soldiers, tired and bloodied, realized that even their best efforts were not enough. Their tanks, once symbols of near-invincible power, lay burning in the fields. Their infantry, brave and skilled, found themselves pushed back step by step. Their commanders, looking at maps covered in red marks, understood what the ground already knew. The counterattack had failed. And failure meant more than losing a battle, it meant losing the last real chance to drive the Allies back into the sea. When the firing finally died down, a strange silence settled across the countryside. Smoke drifted above the hedgerows in slow ribbons. Burnt fields glowed faintly with the last embers of fire. The smell of scorched metal hung heavy in the warm air. Soldiers wandered the fields, stepping carefully among destroyed vehicles and broken branches. Medics tended to the wounded on both sides. Officers radioed in reports that confirmed what everyone now sensed. The Germans would not be able to mount another major attack like this again. Their armored forces were crippled. Their air support nearly gone. Their defenses buckling. And the Allied armies, still growing, still supplied, still supported by overwhelming air power, were ready to move again. A shift had taken place in the heart of Normandy. The Allies were no longer fighting just to survive. They were preparing to break out. To leave the hedgerows behind. To push into open ground where their numbers, strength, and mobility could finally be unleashed. And somewhere in the minds of German officers, as they surveyed the smoking wrecks of their tanks and the long, widening Allied lines, a truth settled like a heavy stone. The war was slipping away. The moment the Armada appeared on the horizon had signaled it. This battlefield confirmed it. And the next days would make it undeniable. In the days that followed the failed German counterattack, a profound change swept across the Normandy front. It did not come with the suddenness of an explosion or the drama of a decisive strike. Instead, it moved slowly, steadily, like a long shadow creeping across the land, quiet but unmistakable. The Allies were beginning to break free. The hedgerows had tested them, slowed them, wounded them. They had learned the hard way that the Normandy countryside was as much an enemy as the soldiers defending it. But now, with new tactics, fresh reinforcements, and a growing sense of confidence, they pushed forward with renewed strength. Tanks fitted with hedgerow cutters carved paths through the walls of green. Infantry units advanced in coordinated waves, each movement supported by artillery and air power. Communication improved. Officers gathered scattered units and molded them into organized fighting forces. The early chaos of the invasion was fading, replaced by precision and momentum. The Germans saw it happening. They watched their enemies adapt. They saw the Allied lines grow wider, deeper, stronger. They counted the constant flow of trucks, jeeps, tanks, guns, and men pouring through the beachheads each day. They felt their own strength thinning in comparison, their fuel dwindling, their ammunition stretched, their troops exhausted. And though they fought with desperate courage, many German soldiers sensed that the tide had already turned. Villages that had been battlegrounds now lay firmly in Allied hands. Columns of soldiers moved through the streets, stepping cautiously over rubble and broken glass. Tanks rolled past shattered church towers. Engineers repaired roads behind them, clearing debris, filling craters, setting up signposts to guide the endless flow of reinforcements. Liberated civilians emerged from hiding with expressions that mixed relief with disbelief. They brought bread, water, and whatever small gifts they could find to the soldiers. Children approached with shy curiosity. Elderly men shook hands with tears in their eyes. Women, after years of fear and silence, spoke freely again. These moments filled the soldiers with a warmth that the war had nearly taken from them. For many, it was the first time they truly understood the impact of what they had done, that their struggle was not only for military victory, but for the restoration of a world that had been nearly lost. But even as these scenes unfolded, the Germans were preparing to dig in deeper. They knew the Allies were approaching open ground, terrain that would allow armored divisions to move freely, to strike fast, to unleash the full power of their numbers. The Germans' best defensive advantage had been the hedgerows, and once those were behind them, the battlefield would shift dramatically. To delay this inevitable breakout, German commanders fortified towns, villages, and crossroads with everything they had left. They positioned their remaining tanks in hull-down locations, hiding them behind ridges where only their turrets were visible. Artillery was placed in orchards, camouflaged with branches. Snipers occupied church towers and farmhouses. Machine gun nests were dug into the earth like small pockets of iron will. Yet for all their effort, the Allies had something the Germans could no longer match: complete control of the skies. Every morning the air vibrated with the hum of Allied aircraft. Fighters swept across the battlefield, strafing German positions with deadly accuracy. Bombers targeted supply lines, bridges, communication hubs, and troop concentrations miles behind the front. The Germans could not move without being seen. They could not regroup without being struck. The countryside itself seemed to work against them. With each passing day, the German defense looked less like a wall and more like a series of isolated islands, drifting apart in a rising tide. Then the breakout began. It started with a massive Allied bombardment, a thunderous storm of artillery fire that pounded German positions for hours. The ground shook violently. Trees snapped. Houses collapsed into clouds of dust and brick. The sky turned black with smoke, then bright again with the flashes of explosions. When the guns finally fell silent, an eerie stillness settled over the land. Then the tanks moved. Columns of Shermans, Cromwells, and Churchills surged forward, engines roaring. Infantry followed closely behind, their boots thudding against the earth as they advanced through gaps torn open by bombardment. Dust rose into the air, carried by the warm summer wind. The Germans tried to hold. They fired from hidden bunkers. They launched counterattacks with their remaining armored units. They set up ambushes in narrow lanes. Some positions fought to the last, refusing to surrender even when surrounded. But the weight of the Allied advance was too much. It pressed forward like a rising wave, engulfing everything in its path. And as the Allies pushed through the German defenses, they reached open ground, wide fields, rolling hills, long roads stretching into the distance. This was the terrain they had been waiting for. This was where their full force could finally be unleashed. The breakout accelerated. Tanks thundered across fields that had been untouched by battle. Infantry rode on their backs, rifles in hand, hair blowing in the wind. Trucks and jeeps raced behind them. Artillery crews moved forward, setting up new positions every hour. The entire front surged like a giant made of steel and resolve. For the Germans, the sight was devastating. They watched from shattered windows and broken trenches as the Allied columns moved with unstoppable momentum. They saw their own lines collapse, their units fall back in disarray, their defenses crumble under the pressure of combined armor and air power. Their commanders issued frantic orders, but many of their messages never reached their units. Communications were broken. Roads were blocked. Chaos spread like wildfire. The breakout was no longer a push, it was a flood. Towns that had held firm for weeks fell within hours. Resistance melted. German units withdrew not out of choice but because they had no other option. The Allies swept through the countryside with speed and coordination, capturing key positions, encircling German forces, cutting off retreat paths. The front line was no longer a line. It was a wave. And behind that wave, a new energy filled the Allied ranks, a mix of relief, pride, and raw momentum. They had fought through fear. They had survived the beaches. They had learned the deadly lessons of the hedgerows. And now, for the first time since landing on Normandy's shores, they were moving freely across open ground. The German commanders knew exactly what this meant. They studied maps late into the night, their faces pale as they saw the danger forming around their armies. They watched arrows sweep across the paper like strokes of fate. They argued over strategy, searching for anything that might halt the advance. But the truth became clearer with each passing hour. The Allies were breaking out of Normandy. And once they broke out, nothing could stop them from reaching further into France, and eventually toward Germany itself. In those dim command rooms, under flickering lights and the constant sound of distant explosions, a realization settled into the minds of Germany's leaders. A realization they had hoped to avoid. A realization they had fought desperately to postpone. What they had seen forming the morning 7,000 ships appeared, had now taken shape completely. The war was moving toward its final path. And that path led to only one end. The breakout from Normandy spread across France like a storm breaking loose from months of heavy clouds. Once the Allies had pierced the German lines, their momentum became unstoppable. Columns of tanks rushed along open roads. Infantry rode on their armor, dust rising behind them in long golden trails. Villages that had lived in fear for 4 long years watched in disbelief as liberation arrived with engines roaring and flags waving. German commanders scrambled to form new defensive lines, but nothing held. Bridges were captured. Railroads were cut. Entire divisions found themselves surrounded as the Allied advance moved faster than they could retreat. The French resistance rose across the countryside, sabotaging supply routes, guiding Allied patrols, and fighting openly alongside them. Cities fell one by one, Alsace, Avranches, Argentan. Then came the great encirclement at Falaise. Here the German army's hopes came undone. Allied forces from the north and south closed in like tightening jaws. The German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army found themselves trapped in a shrinking pocket of destruction. Smoke choked the air. Fields burned. Vehicles lay overturned, shattered by artillery and airstrikes. Soldiers tried to flee through narrow gaps, but the escape routes collapsed faster than they could reach them. Thousands were captured. Thousands more never made it out. The German command knew the truth. Normandy was lost. Paris rose next. Crowds flooded the streets, tears mixing with laughter as the Allies marched in triumph. France was breathing again. Europe was waking up. And behind the celebration, one clear message echoed. Germany's war machine had begun its final collapse. The retreat back toward the German border became a desperate, punishing journey. Fuel was scarce. Morale was fading. Villages once claimed as part of a future empire were now abandoned in haste. Roads filled with fleeing soldiers and broken vehicles. The once mighty German divisions were now shadows of their former selves. And through it all the Allies pushed on, determined, united, unstoppable. For the soldiers who had landed on D-Day, who had crawled through the sand under machine gun fire, who had fought through hedgerows and survived the counterattacks, the sight of the German border felt surreal. After years of war, sacrifice, and loss, the end was finally coming into view. Germany felt it too. In concrete bunkers along the Rhine, in dimly lit command rooms, in the quiet fear of retreating soldiers, the realization grew heavier each day. The war would not end in victory. It would end in consequence. The tide that began with 7,000 ships on a mist-covered morning had reached its full force. And nothing, no tank, no bunker, no final stand, could stop what was coming. As winter approached, the Germans launched one last desperate offensive in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge. But even this final attempt could not reverse the course of history. The Allies pushed back stronger than ever. The German lines shattered again. And by spring Allied forces crossed the Rhine. Germany's cities were falling. Its armies were breaking. Its leaders were trapped in denial. The final truth had arrived. By the time Allied soldiers reached the heart of Germany, the landscape had changed from rolling French fields to shattered cities and burned-out streets. The war that began with fire had ended in ruin. Every bridge, every road, every river crossing carried the scars of desperate retreat. German civilians moved through the rubble slowly, silently, carrying what little remained of their lives. Their faces, exhausted and hollow, revealed a truth that stretched deeper than politics. No one had escaped this war untouched. As the Allied armies advanced further, they uncovered the full horror of what the Third Reich had built. The concentration camps, the mass graves, the silent buildings where unspeakable atrocities had taken place. Soldiers who had survived Omaha Beach, the hedgerows, Corentin, and the breakout now stood in shock, unable to comprehend the scale of the cruelty they found. The war, once seen as a fight for liberation, took on a new and heavier meaning. It had become a fight for humanity itself. And so, in the spring of 1945, the final walls of Nazi Germany began to collapse. Allied troops crossed the Elbe. Soviet forces pressed in from the east. German divisions surrendered by the tens of thousands. Cities raised white flags. Entire regions fell without resistance. Hitler's regime, built on fear and illusion, crumbled under the weight of the world closing in. Then at last, on a quiet May morning, Germany surrendered. No crowds cheered in the streets of Berlin. No triumph echoed from towers. Only silence, deep and heavy, settling over a nation that had been broken by its own leadership and its own choices. The war in Europe, the war that had consumed continents, taken tens of millions of lives and reshaped societies, was over. For the soldiers who had stepped onto the beaches of Normandy, the moment carried a strange mixture of relief and sorrow. Many had not made it this far. Their memories stayed in the sand and soil, in the hedgerows and fields, in the letters they never finished and the promises they never returned to. Their sacrifice was carried forward by the men who walked now through a freed Europe,